Act 3. The Egyptologists are back. The initial discovery of the Joseph Smith papyri caught Latter-day Saints flat-footed. There was no one in the community who was a trained Egyptologist. They initially had to rely on outsiders to provide translations and assessments of the meaning of the documents, but it also inspired a number of Latter-day Saints to go into Egyptology and continues to do so today. In the spring of 1995, Stephen Thompson wrote Egyptology and the Book of Abraham, which reviews the literature and debates that had become increasingly mired in apologetics. This article focuses on the facsimiles, which had become a really key place where we can compare Smith's translations of an actual document with those of the Egyptologists who know the language and culture that produced them. In particular, Michael Rhodes' short essay in the 1992 Encyclopedia of Mormonism contained the remarkable and false claim that, quote, the prophet's explanations of each of the facsimiles accord with present understanding of Egyptian religious practice. Thompson's article challenges this claim. He walks through a correct dating of the manuscripts, first of all, to the Ptolemaic period or Greco-Roman era. Many of Nibley's comparisons were to Egyptian texts more than 1,200 years earlier, and the comparisons just didn't hold up. Thompson looks at the whole generation of Egyptological apologetics up to that point that attempted to vindicate Joseph Smith's readings and found them to be pretty weak or just wrong. This article also examines the translation of the Book of Abraham to see whether it represents something that could have come from Abraham or Abraham's time. Instead, he finds numerous anachronisms, such as the place names Chaldea, the word Pharaoh, Egyptus, and numerous other terms, historical claims, and ideas that definitively come from a later period. The Winter 2000 issue has a 3-article series on the Book of Abraham. Robert Rittner is a famed Egyptologist, first at Yale, where he taught apologist John Gee before their epic rivalry, and later at Chicago. He's taken a strong interest in challenging apologetic arguments about this text. Rittner was the student of Klaus Baer, the first person to translate the papyri in the 1968 dialogue issue. Rittner's article, The Breathing Permit of Hor 34 Years Later, traces the history of various translations and notes the absence of any formal edition of the text with a full translation and transliteration. He then provides both in this article, an invaluable resource. The text, he explains, is a formal document or permit created by Isis and then copied by Tahut to assure that the deified, or HOR, regains the ability to breathe and function after death, with full mobility, access to offerings, and all other privileges of the immortal gods. The implications, basic symbolism, and intent of the text are certain. Rittner later published a critical edition of the papyri that has been considered highly reliable. Edward Ashman's short article in this same issue, Joseph Smith's Identification of Abraham in Papyrus JS1, The Breathing Permit of Hor, further connects Joseph Smith's Egyptian alphabet and grammar to the Book of Abraham, showing how Smith, or someone close to him, chose specific Egyptian characters and assigned them the name Abraham, but none of these mean Abraham. The final article in this 3-part series is from Bradley Cook, The Book of Abraham and the Islamic Qisas al-Anbiya, Tales of the Prophets, Extant Literature. This picks up on arguments that other apologists had been making that there were ancient parallels that Joseph Smith could not have known about between the Book of Abraham and other legends about Abraham. Cook's article adds Islamic legends to the discussion. Dating to the 800s and 900s CE in their earliest forms, these stories became quite popular. He dismisses the similarities of the Book of Abraham to ancient Jewish writings that Smith would have known, especially as it relates to Abraham's astronomical skill. Cook finds numerous parallels to the Islamic literature, which Smith could not have known. Finally, I want to turn to some recent articles that help to settle another debate about the Book of Abraham. In winter 2010, Chris Smith and Andrew W. Cook wrote The Original Length of the Scroll of Hor, which put an end to the missing scroll hypothesis for the Book of Abraham. This had become popularized by John Gee. Cook and Smith used mathematical calculations to determine the spiral of the scroll and how long it might have been. there was not enough space on the scroll to contain a hieratic edition of the Book of Abraham. He pushed back with an alternative mathematical theory in a separate article somewhere else, but Andrew Cook demolishes this argument in the summer 2012 issue of Dialogue, Formulas and Facts, a response to John Gee. It's a hilarious pointing out of mathematical errors, showing that John Gee's alternative theory is exactly the same mathematical formula that Cook and Smith had, and it leads to exactly the same results on the length. So much for that. There are two final developments worth noting. In the mid-2010s, as part of a wave of transparency, the LDS Church released a Gospel Topics essay on translation and historicity of the Book of Abraham. It acknowledged that there were some ancient parallels, but said that its truthfulness doesn't depend on that. It also acknowledges that the translation of Facsimile 1 does not match Egyptian, and that nothing in the papyri corresponds to the Book of Abraham. It puts forward a theory that there might be missing elements to the scrolls that might have contained a Book of Abraham, but this theory, as we mentioned, isn't really supported anymore. At the same time, there's another argument that essentially translation means something more like revelation. Quote, Joseph's translation was not a literal rendering of the papyri as a conventional translation would be. Rather, the physical artifacts provided an occasion for meditation, reflection, and revelation. They catalyzed a process whereby God gave to Joseph Smith a revelation about the life of Abraham, even if that revelation did not directly correlate to the characters on the papyri. The catalyst theory gained official recognition as one possibility. The second development is that the Church History Department has now published critical editions of all of these documents as part of the Joseph Smith Papers Project and can be accessed online. But strangely, John Gee has gone to war with the Church History Department, writing a series of misguided articles attacking the Church's scholars. The LDS historians and Egyptologists who have looked at these issues most closely don't affirm his theories. It turns out that the Joseph Smith papers are highly reliable, and most of the disagreements are minor differences of interpretation rather than significant points. So if you're really interested in the manuscripts, you can go there. I learned a lot in preparing this episode. What's remarkable to me is how stable the debate has been for the past 50-plus years, focusing on historicity issues and attempting to provide some historical setting for the Book of Abraham, whether ancient or modern. Most of these major theories were laid out right from the beginning, though the missing scroll theory hasn't held up. Instead, we're left with the catalyst theory, that either produced a revelation of an authentically ancient Book of Abraham or a modern text of genuine religious value, or not. But what is missing has been a serious theological analysis, which we're beginning to see in some quarters, yet much more needs to be done. Hopefully new scholarship will emerge, and hopefully in the pages of Dialogue. Thank you for taking this journey with me and for taking the journey through Dialogue Journal, and for all your support. If you want to subscribe or donate to Dialogue, you can do so at dialoguejournal.com/subscribe. This episode was written by me with editing and music by Daniel Foster Smith. Our content manager is Emily Jensen. Our social media managers are Adam McLean and Calvin Burke. The Dialogue Journal podcast is produced by the Dialogue Foundation, a registered 501c3, with support from Mary Thieves. This show is part of the Dialogue Podcast Network, a collective of independent, interesting podcasts who promote thoughtful, respectful, and engaging inquiry and discussion of all aspects of the LDS tradition, thought, and arts and culture. Like The Foyer, where one or more distinguished guests will join Dr. Patrick Mason, Leonard Arrington Chair of Mormon Studies at Utah State University, for a thoughtful but informal conversation about Mormon history and culture. The Foyer is one of the newest members of the network. Check out all the shows at dialoguejournal.com/podcast network. That's dialoguejournal.com/podcast network.